The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of the Sussex family's Montecito home as Prince Harry sat in his study, staring at the final edit of what would become one of the most controversial Netflix documentaries ever produced by a member of the British royal family. The weight of the decision before him felt heavier than any military medal he had ever worn, heavier than the burden of royal duty he had carried for 38 years of his life. Harry's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, the steam rising like the memories that had been haunting him for months. The documentary, titled The Truth Behind the Crown, contained footage and revelations that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. But it was one particular segment that made his heart race with both fear and determination, the part where he would finally reveal the systematic lies told to protect his older brother, Prince William. In the adjacent room, Meghan was helping their children with breakfast, her melodious voice carrying through the house as she read Archie a story about brave knights and distant kingdoms. The irony wasn't lost on Harry. Here he was, about to expose the very kingdom he had once sworn to protect, all while his wife created magical worlds for their son, worlds where truth and justice always prevailed. The decision to create this documentary hadn't come easily. 4 months after stepping back from royal duties, Harry had wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him longed to maintain the silence that had been drilled into him since childhood, the unwritten rule that family matters stayed within family walls. But another part of him, the part that had grown stronger since moving to California, demanded that the truth finally see daylight. The catalyst had come 6 months earlier during a private phone conversation with his father, King Charles. Harry had called to discuss a potential visit to the UK for a charity event close to his heart, one supporting veterans with mental health struggles. The conversation had started warmly enough, with Charles expressing genuine interest in Harry's well-being and asking about the grandchildren he rarely saw. But then, the conversation had taken a darker turn. Charles had mentioned, almost casually, that William had been struggling with some negative press regarding his environmental initiatives. Some investigative journalists had uncovered what appeared to be contradictions between William's public stance on climate change and certain private investments. The story was gaining traction, and the palace was concerned. Perhaps, Charles had suggested in that diplomatic tone Harry knew so well, your Netflix people could find a way to create some positive content about William's work. A documentary showcasing his environmental efforts might help shift the narrative. Harry had felt his stomach drop. It wasn't the first time the family had suggested he use his media connections to benefit the monarchy, but it was the most blatant. When Harry had politely declined, explaining that his production company focused on different types of content, Charles's tone had shifted noticeably. Harry, his father had said, and there was an edge to his voice that reminded Harry of countless childhood conversations, family loyalty works both ways. We've been very supportive of your situation in America. We've refrained from publicly contradicting some of the more inflammatory claims you and Meghan have made. Perhaps it's time you considered what you owe the family that raised you. The conversation had ended cordially enough, but Harry had been left with a feeling that wouldn't shake. Later that evening, while Meghan put the children to bed, he had called his brother directly. The conversation with William had been even more revealing. William had been more direct than their father. He explained that several stories damaging to his reputation had been managed over the years by deflecting attention to other family members' controversies. Sometimes it was their father's environmental contradictions, sometimes their cousin's party antics, and sometimes Harry's blood had run cold as William said this, sometimes it was stories about Harry's own past mistakes that were strategically timed for release. It's not personal, Harry, William had said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of older brother superiority that Harry remembered from childhood. It's just how things work. The institution protects itself, and, right now, I represent the future of that institution. Surely you understand. Harry had understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how disposable he had always been in the eyes of the institution he had served his entire life. The realization that his own family had been using his past mistakes as weapons to shield his brother from criticism felt like a betrayal deeper than any he had experienced. That night, lying awake in bed while Meghan slept peacefully beside him, Harry had made his decision. If the institution was willing to sacrifice him to protect William, then, perhaps it was time the world knew exactly how that protection system worked. The documentary had taken months to produce. Harry had worked with a small, trusted team of filmmakers who understood the gravity of what they were creating. They had interviewed former palace staff, royal correspondents who had grown tired of being used as mouthpieces, and even some members of parliament who had grown concerned about the lack of transparency in royal communications. But the most damning evidence had come from Harry's own archives. Years of text messages, emails, and recorded phone conversations told a story of systematic deception that went far beyond normal royal PR management. They revealed a pattern of lies, manipulations, and strategic character assassinations designed specifically to protect William's image at the expense of other family members. One particularly damning exchange showed how a story about Harry's brief experimentation with drugs in his early 20s had been deliberately leaked to the press on the same day that an investigation into William's use of royal helicopters for personal trips was set to be published. The timing hadn't been coincidental, it had been carefully orchestrated to bury the William story under an avalanche of coverage about Harry's past mistakes. Another set of documents revealed how stories about Meghan's supposed difficult behavior toward palace staff had been embellished and, sometimes completely fabricated to distract from questions about William's wife Kate's extended absences from royal duties. The campaign against Meghan hadn't just been about racism, though that had certainly been a factor. It had been about creating a villain to make William and Kate look like the perfect royal couple by comparison. As Harry reviewed the final cut one more time, he felt the weight of what he was about to unleash. The documentary didn't just expose the lies told to protect William, it revealed the entire machinery of modern royal propaganda, showing how the British press and the palace worked together to shape public perception through carefully timed revelations, strategic leaks, and sometimes outright deception. The most powerful moment in the documentary came when Harry spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady but his eyes reflecting years of pain and betrayal. He explained how he had once been willing to be the spare, the backup, the one whose reputation could be sacrificed when necessary. But becoming a father had changed everything. He couldn't bear the thought of Archie and Lilibet growing up in a system that would use them as disposable shields for their cousins. They constantly lie to protect Prince William, Harry said in what would become the documentary's most quoted line. And they've made it clear that they're willing to destroy anyone, including family members, to maintain that protection. The British people deserve to know how their future king's image is really maintained. The phone call from William came 3 hours after Netflix had sent advance copies to major news outlets for review. Harry had been expecting it, but hearing his brother's voice still sent a chill through him. "How could you do this to me?" William's voice was raw with emotion, a far cry from his usual composed royal demeanor. "I'm your brother, Harry. Whatever our differences, I'm still your brother." Harry had felt his own composure crack slightly. Despite everything, William was right. They were brothers, and Harry could remember a time when that had meant everything to both of them. But that was before Harry had learned the cost of being William's brother in a system designed to protect only one of them. "You stopped being my brother the day you decided I was expendable," Harry had replied, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. "This documentary isn't about destroying you, William. It's about showing people what this system really is, what it's willing to do to maintain itself. If you can't see the difference, then maybe we never really knew each other at all." The call had ended with William hanging up, but not before Harry heard something in his brother's voice that he hadn't heard since they were children: genuine fear. For the first time in his life, William was facing consequences that couldn't be managed, spun, or deflected onto someone else. Now, sitting in his study as the California sun climbed higher in the sky, Harry felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief, certainly, at finally telling his truth without filters or palace management. There was sadness at the knowledge that this documentary would likely end any possibility of reconciliation with his family. But there was also something else, something he hadn't felt in years of royal life: genuine hope. Hope that his children would grow up in a world where truth mattered more than image management. Hope that the British people would demand better from their institutions. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the monarchy could evolve into something more honest, more transparent, more worthy of the people it was supposed to serve. The documentary was set to release in 48 hours, and Harry knew that once it aired, there would be no going back. The palace would respond, probably with their own coordinated media campaign designed to discredit him and protect William. The British press would choose sides, and the public would be left to decide who to believe. But, for the first time in his adult life, Harry felt like he was fighting on the right side of a battle. Not for an institution that had used him, not for a brother who had betrayed him, but for the simple principle that truth should matter more than convenience. As he closed his laptop and prepared to face whatever storm was coming, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in years of royal duty: genuine pride in his choices. The next 48 hours would test everything he had learned about courage, about family, about the difference between loyalty and complicity. But, as he walked toward the kitchen where his wife and children were waiting, Harry felt ready for whatever came next. The truth was finally going to be told, and, whatever the cost, it would be worth it. 24 hours before the documentary's release, the palace's response machine was already in full motion. Harry's phone buzzed constantly with messages from journalists, former friends, and palace officials, all trying to gauge his commitment to releasing what one royal correspondent had already dubbed the most damaging royal documentary since Diana's Panorama interview. Harry had turned his phone to silent and placed it in a drawer, but Meghan kept him updated on the most significant developments. The palace had released what they called a preemptive statement, expressing disappointment that private family matters were being exploited for commercial gain. They didn't mention Harry by name, but everyone understood the target. More concerning was the campaign that seemed to be building behind the scenes. Meghan had received calls from friends in London warning her that several British newspapers were preparing coordinated responses for the day after the documentary's release. The stories would question Harry's mental health, his memories of events, and his motivations for making the documentary. "They're going to say you're bitter, jealous, and possibly unstable," Meghan had told him over breakfast, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you prepared for that?" Harry had looked at his wife, this strong woman who had endured her own character assassination at the hands of the same machine now preparing to target him, and felt his resolve strengthen rather than weaken. If Meghan could survive what they had thrown at her, he could face whatever was coming. "Let them," he had replied. "I've got documentation for everything in that documentary. Let them try to dispute facts with character attacks." But, even as he said it, Harry felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came with challenging an institution that had centuries of experience in protecting itself. The monarchy had survived world wars, political upheavals, and countless scandals by adapting, deflecting, and, when necessary, sacrificing individuals to preserve the larger institution. Harry was about to test whether that system could survive a sustained attack from someone who knew all its secrets. The documentary's most explosive revelations centered around three major incidents that Harry had never spoken about publicly before. The first involved a period in 2017 when William had been under investigation by parliamentary committees for his use of royal resources. Several MPs had raised questions about William's helicopter usage, his work schedule, and whether he was fulfilling his royal duties while pursuing his air ambulance career. Harry's documentary included recorded conversations and email exchanges showing how palace officials had deliberately orchestrated a series of negative stories about Harry's party lifestyle to distract from the investigation into William. The timing had been so precise that Harry had initially thought it was coincidental. Only years later had he discovered the truth. The recordings were devastating in their casualness. Palace officials discussing Harry's value as a distraction asset and debating which of his past indiscretions would be most effective at burying negative William coverage. They spoke about Harry as if he were a commodity to be deployed rather than a human being, let alone a member of their own royal family. One particularly damning conversation included a senior palace aide laughing about how Harry makes it so easy for us because his genuine struggles with mental health and past mistakes provided such rich material for strategic leaks. The aide had gone on to suggest that they should keep a reserve of Harry's stories for future use, treating the prince's pain as ammunition for protecting his brother. The second major revelation concerned Harry's military service. The documentary revealed that several security breaches during Harry's deployment in Afghanistan hadn't been the result of poor operational security, as publicly claimed, but had been deliberately leaked by palace officials to create drama and sympathy for Harry while burying stories about William's controversial comments regarding the Commonwealth. Harry had always wondered how his location had been compromised so consistently, putting not just him but his entire unit at risk. The documentary showed email exchanges proving that palace officials had been the source of the leaks, sacrificing Harry's safety and the safety of his fellow soldiers to manage William's public image. The betrayal cut particularly deep because Harry's military service had been one of the few aspects of his royal life that he had felt was genuinely his own. Learning that even this had been manipulated and compromised for his brother's benefit had shattered one of his last positive associations with the institution he had served. The third revelation was perhaps the most personal and painful. The documentary included evidence that the palace had actively discouraged Harry from seeking professional help for his mental health struggles in the years following his mother's death. Not because they were concerned about stigma or royal image, but because an emotionally struggling Harry was more useful to them than a stable one. Internal memos showed palace officials discussing how Harry's visible emotional pain made him more relatable to the public and provided excellent cover for any negative William stories. They had calculated that a grieving, struggling Harry generated more positive press coverage for the royal family overall than a healthy, confident one would. The memos included discussions about how to maintain Harry's emotional instability at a manageable level, enough to be useful for public sympathy and distraction purposes, but not so much that it would create genuine scandal. They had essentially weaponized Harry's grief and trauma for public relations purposes. As Harry reviewed these revelations one final time before the documentary's release, he felt a complex mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Vindication because finally, people would understand that his struggles hadn't just been personal failings or family dysfunction, they had been the result of systematic manipulation by people who were supposed to protect him. Sadness because the evidence made clear just how thoroughly he had been betrayed by the institution he had dedicated his life to serving. The documentary also included testimony from former palace staff who had grown uncomfortable with the systematic deception they had been asked to participate in. Sarah Jenkins, a former communications director who had left the palace in 2019, provided particularly damning testimony about the culture of lies and manipulation that surrounded William's image management. It wasn't enough to just promote Prince William positively, Jenkins explained in her interview. The strategy was always comparative. William had to look good compared to someone else looking bad. And Harry was always the preferred target for that comparison because he was family. Attacking him felt more like internal discipline than public relations manipulation. Jenkins described meetings where palace officials would discuss Harry management as if he were a crisis to be contained rather than a person to be supported. She revealed how they had developed what they called deflection protocols, predetermined strategies for redirecting negative coverage away from William and onto other family members, with Harry being the primary target. The documentary showed how these deflection protocols had been used dozens of times over the years. Every time William faced criticism for his work ethic, his environmental contradictions, or his wife's extended absences from royal duties, a negative Harry story would mysteriously surface within days. The timing was so consistent that Harry had eventually hired a private analyst to track the patterns, and the correlation was undeniable. Perhaps most shocking was the revelation that some of Harry's most embarrassing moments had been deliberately engineered. The documentary included evidence suggesting that Harry's famous Las Vegas party photos hadn't been accidentally leaked by fellow partygoers, as publicly believed, but had been arranged by palace officials who needed a major distraction from a brewing scandal about William's use of royal funds for personal renovations. The photos had been taken by someone specifically planted at the party, and the timing of their release had been carefully calculated to overshadow parliamentary questions about William's spending. Harry had been set up by his own family staff, his trust and youth exploited to create the exact kind of scandal they needed. As the documentary's release approached, Harry found himself experiencing emotions he hadn't felt since his military days, the calm focus that came before a major operation. He knew that once the documentary aired, he would be under attack from multiple directions. The palace would deploy every resource at their disposal to discredit him and minimize the damage to William and the monarchy. But Harry also knew something that the palace didn't: he wasn't the same person who had left the UK 4 years earlier. His time in California, his therapy work, his marriage to Meghan, and his role as a father had given him a strength and clarity that his family had never seen. They were expecting to face the emotionally unstable Harry they had helped create and maintain for years. Instead, they would be dealing with someone who had learned to fight back intelligently and effectively. The final hours before the documentary's release were spent in careful preparation. Harry and Meghan's security team had been briefed on potential threats, their children's schedules had been adjusted to minimize public exposure, and their legal team was standing by to respond to any defamatory counterclaims from the palace. Harry had also reached out to his grandmother's cousin, Princess Alexandra, who had always been kind to him and had expressed private concerns about how the family treated its younger members. Alexandra had agreed to watch the documentary and provide her honest assessment, giving Harry at least one family member who might understand his perspective. As the sun set over Montecito on the eve of the documentary's release, Harry felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring chaos, accusations, and probably legal challenges. The British press would unleash everything they had been saving for such a moment. His family would close ranks and treat him as a traitor and a threat. But tonight, Harry felt free. Free from the burden of protecting people who had never protected him. Free from the obligation to maintain lies that had cost him his mental health, his military career, and his relationship with his homeland. Free from being the spare who could be sacrificed whenever the heir needed protection. The documentary would speak for itself. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was credible, and the pattern of deception was undeniable. Whatever happened next, Harry had finally told his truth completely and honestly. After 38 years of being used as a pawn in someone else's game, he was finally playing by his own rules. As he kissed his children goodnight and prepared for what might be the most challenging period of his life, Harry felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: genuine excitement about the future. Tomorrow, the world would finally see the truth about the institution that claimed to serve them. And, whatever that truth cost him personally, it would be worth it for the chance to build something better for his children. The documentary released at exactly midnight GMT, simultaneously appearing on Netflix platforms across the globe. Within the first hour, viewing numbers had shattered every record for documentary premieres on the platform. By dawn in London, the hashtag Prince Harry Truth was trending worldwide, and major news organizations were scrambling to verify and respond to the explosive claims contained in the 2-hour film. Harry had barely slept, despite Meghan's encouragement to rest before the storm hit. He had spent the night in his study, monitoring social media reactions, news coverage, and the immediate responses from various palace sources. The reactions were as polarizing as he had expected, but the sheer volume of support surprised him. The documentary had been meticulously fact-checked and legally vetted, with every claim backed by documentation, recorded conversations, or corroborated testimony. Harry's legal team had anticipated that the palace would challenge specific facts rather than address the broader pattern of deception, and they were prepared for that strategy. The first official response came not from Buckingham Palace, but from Kensington Palace, William's office. The statement was brief and predictably dismissive. The Duke of Cambridge is saddened that private family conversations have been taken out of context and misrepresented for commercial purposes. His Royal Highness remains focused on his duties to the British people and will not be engaging with these accusations. Harry read the statement 3 times, feeling a familiar mixture of frustration and vindication. Even in their denial, they couldn't help themselves from using the exact tactics the documentary had exposed, dismissing legitimate concerns as taken out of context and positioning William as the victim while avoiding any engagement with the actual evidence presented. But the public reaction suggested that people were no longer buying the palace's traditional deflection strategies. Social media was flooded with detailed analysis of the documentary's evidence, with viewers sharing timestamps of particularly damning moments and creating viral threads breaking down the patterns of deception Harry had revealed. More significantly, several British MPs were already calling for parliamentary investigations into the use of public funds for private royal PR campaigns. The documentary had included evidence that taxpayer money allocated for official royal communications had been used to fund the systematic character assassination campaigns against Harry and other family members. The most immediate impact came from an unexpected source: current and former royal staff members. Within hours of the documentary's release, Harry's production team was being contacted by palace employees who wanted to share their own experiences of being asked to lie, manipulate information, or participate in the deception campaigns Harry had exposed. One particularly significant contact came from James Morrison, a former private secretary to Prince William who had left his position under mysterious circumstances in 2020. Morrison reached out through intermediaries to offer additional documentation that supported Harry's claims and revealed even more extensive deception than the documentary had covered. Morrison's evidence included internal palace planning documents for what they called reputation management campaigns, systematic efforts to damage the public perception of various royal family members when their positive coverage threatened to overshadow William's image. The documents revealed that these campaigns hadn't just targeted Harry, but also Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and even some of William's own cousins when their popularity ratings climbed too high. The documentation showed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even Harry. Palace officials had tracked public opinion polls and social media sentiment with scientific precision, deploying negative stories about family members whenever their approval ratings threatened to exceed William's. They had turned the royal family into a zero-sum game where William could only succeed if everyone else failed. Perhaps most damaging was evidence that this systematic undermining had extended to charitable work. The documents showed how palace officials had deliberately sabotaged other family members' charitable initiatives when they received too much positive attention, ensuring that William's environmental and mental health work remained the primary focus of royal charitable coverage. Harry learned about Morrison's revelations during a secure video call with his legal team, and the weight of the additional evidence was almost overwhelming. His documentary had only scratched the surface of a deception campaign that was far more extensive and cruel than even he had imagined. This goes beyond sibling rivalry or institutional protection, his lead attorney explained during the call. This is evidence of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation and character assassination that may have legal implications beyond just family drama. As the day progressed, the palace's response strategy became clearer. Rather than addressing the specific evidence Harry had presented, they were deploying what appeared to be a coordinated character assassination campaign against him. Stories began appearing in friendly media outlets questioning Harry's mental state, his motivations, and even his memory of events. The Times of London published a lengthy piece by a royal correspondent suggesting that Harry's claims were the result of unresolved trauma and possible false memory syndrome. The Daily Mail ran a front-page story headlined "Is Harry having a breakdown?" with unnamed palace sources expressing deep concern for his mental health. The tactics were so predictable that Harry almost found them amusing, if they weren't so vicious. The palace was using exactly the playbook the documentary had exposed, attacking the messenger rather than addressing the message, using mental health stigma as a weapon, and deploying anonymous sources to avoid accountability for their claims. But the strategy was backfiring in ways the palace hadn't anticipated. The public had just watched 2 hours of documentation showing exactly how these character assassination campaigns worked, and now they were watching one unfold in real time. Social media users were pointing out the obvious parallels between the tactics shown in the documentary and the palace's current response. More significantly, mental health advocates were pushing back hard against the attempt to weaponize Harry's previous struggles with depression and anxiety. Organizations that Harry had worked with during his royal years issued statements supporting his courage in speaking out and condemning the use of mental health stigma to silence victims of institutional abuse. Dr. Sarah Chen, a prominent psychiatrist who had appeared in the documentary to discuss the psychological impact of the manipulation Harry had endured, gave a particularly powerful interview to the BBC. "What we're seeing now is exactly what Prince Harry documented, the systematic use of character assassination to silence criticism. The fact that they're using his previous mental health struggles against him only proves his point about how cruel and calculated this system really is." The turning point came in the afternoon when Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, released an unprecedented personal statement. Known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce independence, Anne had always been respected for her straightforward communication style. "Having watched my nephew's documentary," Anne's statement read, "I feel compelled to say that his account aligns with my own observations of how family members are treated when they become inconvenient to institutional priorities. While I disagree with the decision to make these matters public, I cannot dispute the accuracy of what has been presented." Anne's statement sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. As the king's sister and one of the most respected members of the royal family, her validation of Harry's claims carried enormous weight. More importantly, Her statement suggested that the documentary's revelations were not the bitter fantasies of a disgruntled exile, but the documented experiences of multiple family members. Within hours of Anne's statement, 2 more former palace officials contacted Harry's team with additional evidence. The documentary had created a safe space for people to speak truth about their experiences with the royal institution, and the floodgates were beginning to open. But the most emotionally significant response came from an unexpected source, Diana's former private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, who had remained largely silent about royal family dynamics since leaving his position in the 1990s. Jeffson released a statement that cut to the heart of what Harry's documentary really represented. "Prince Harry has done what his mother never could," Jeffson wrote. "He has provided concrete evidence of the institutional cruelty that Princess Diana experienced but could never prove. The tactics used against Diana, the character assassination, the strategic leaks, the manipulation of media coverage, are clearly still being deployed against family members who threaten the preferred narrative." Jeffson's statement connected Harry's experience directly to his mother's struggles, framing the documentary not as an attack on the monarchy but as a continuation of Diana's fight for honesty and transparency within the royal institution. As evening fell in California, Harry found himself experiencing emotions he hadn't expected. There was relief, certainly, at seeing his truth validated by credible sources. There was gratification at watching the palace's predictable response strategy backfire so spectacularly. But there was also a profound sadness at the realization of just how extensive and systematic the deception had been. The additional evidence emerging from former staff members painted a picture of an institution so focused on protecting William's image that it had lost any sense of basic human decency. Family members weren't just competitors to be managed, they were resources to be exploited and discarded when they were no longer useful. Harry thought about his children, asleep in their beds just down the hall, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. Archie and Lilibet would never be raised in a system that viewed them as expendable assets. They would never be told that their value as human beings depended on how useful they were to someone else's image. The documentary had accomplished more than Harry had dared hope. It hadn't just exposed the lies told to protect William, it had revealed the entire machine of royal propaganda and manipulation. It had shown the world exactly how the modern monarchy really operated, behind the pageantry and public relations. As Harry prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably even more vicious attacks, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: genuine pride in standing up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The truth was finally out, and whatever happened next, it could never be taken back. The British people, and the world, now knew exactly what kind of institution they were supporting. What they chose to do with that knowledge would determine not just the future of the monarchy, but the future of truth and accountability in public life. Harry fell asleep that night with Meghan's hand in his, listening to the ocean waves in the distance, and, for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right side of history. 3 days after the documentary's release, the aftershocks were still reverberating through every level of British society. What had begun as a family dispute had evolved into a constitutional crisis that threatened the very foundations of how the monarchy operated in the modern world. Harry woke to find that the hashtag abolish the monarchy was trending in the UK for the first time since his grandmother's death. Public opinion polls showed that support for the royal family had dropped to its lowest levels since the abdication crisis of 1936. More concerning for the palace, the polls showed that the drop wasn't just among Republicans who had always opposed the monarchy. Significant numbers of previous royal supporters were questioning whether the institution could be reformed or should be abandoned entirely. The morning brought news that Harry hadn't anticipated. Parliamentary leaders from multiple parties were calling for emergency sessions to discuss the constitutional implications of the documentary's revelations. The evidence of taxpayer funds being used for personal character assassination campaigns had crossed a line that even traditionally monarchist politicians couldn't ignore. Sir Graham Wilson, a Conservative MP who had always been a strong royal supporter, gave a particularly damaging interview to the BBC. "If these allegations are true, and the documentation appears to be extensive, then we're looking at a systematic abuse of public resources for private family vendettas. This goes far beyond the traditional boundaries of royal prerogative and into potential criminal territory." But the most significant development came from within the royal family itself. King Charles, who had remained silent for 3 days while his communications team struggled to contain the crisis, finally spoke directly to Harry. The phone call came at 6 a.m. California time, and Harry almost didn't answer when he saw the international number. But something made him pick up, perhaps the hope that his father might finally be ready to address the truth rather than manage it. "Harry." Charles's voice was tired, older than Harry remembered. "We need to talk." "I'm listening, Pa." Harry found himself using the childhood nickname despite everything that had happened. "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the evidence you presented," Charles continued. "I've spoken with staff members, current and former. I've looked at documents I should have demanded to see years ago." There was a long pause, and Harry could hear his father breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "You were right," Charles said finally. "Not about everything, perhaps, but about the essential truth. We failed you. I failed you. And we failed the people we're supposed to serve by allowing this system to continue." Harry felt his throat tighten. This was not the conversation he had expected to have, not after 3 days of coordinated attacks on his character and mental health. "What are you saying, Pa?" "I'm saying that your documentary has forced me to confront things I've been willfully blind to for too long. The way William's image has been protected, the way other family members have been sacrificed for that protection, the systematic lying to the press and the public, it's not sustainable, and it's not right." Charles went on to explain that he had confronted William directly about the specific allegations in the documentary. The conversation, according to Charles, had been devastating. William had initially denied everything, then minimized it, and, finally, admitted that he had known about and approved of the character assassination campaigns against other family members. He actually justified it, Charles said, his voice heavy with disappointment. He said it was necessary to protect the institution, that tough decisions had to be made to ensure the monarchy's survival. He couldn't understand why I was upset about it. Harry felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. He had wanted his family to acknowledge the truth, but hearing about William's callous response to being confronted with his actions was more painful than satisfying. "Where does this leave us?" Harry asked. "I don't know," Charles admitted. "I'm meeting with constitutional experts, parliamentary leaders, and senior church officials to discuss reforms." "Major reforms. The kind of transparency and accountability measures that should have been implemented decades ago." Charles explained that he was considering unprecedented steps, independent oversight of royal communications, public disclosure of how royal funds were used, and formal policies preventing the use of royal resources for personal reputation management. He was even exploring the possibility of family members being held legally accountable for their actions in the same way as any other public officials. "But I need to know," Charles said, "is this about revenge for you, or is it about real change? Because if we're going to rebuild trust with the British people, I need family members who are committed to transparency and accountability. I need to know if you'd be willing to come back and help create something better." "The